So last year we had the Raspberry Pi 4 release, and I picked it up and I was really excited to check it out and see how it would play different games through emulation. But there's one issue. It really wasn't supported when it came out. It was this big deal in the Raspberry Pi community, but it's taken some time for everything to kind of catch up to it. And now that it has, it looks like from what I'm seeing, the Raspberry Pi 4 is an absolute beast. We had benchmarks before that would show how much stronger it technically was than the Raspberry Pi 3, but now we have Retropie releasing a build that is specific and designed around the Raspberry Pi 4, something we have not had up until like last month. Before that, there were some workarounds and different things you could do to make it work, but having something like Retropie actually fully compatible and built for it is exciting stuff. So today I wanted to go ahead and build one of these out, check it out, play some games on it and see how it is, because I did a video a while ago on the Raspberry Pi 3 and I really like that device, so I figure, hey, let's check out the Raspberry Pi 4, because from the specs and everything about it, it looks like it's the new gaming beast to get. Now you'll notice I have two different boxes here. This one is a case. That's something else I was kind of waiting to really, I guess, kind of build up over time as manufacturers kind of got a hold of the Raspberry Pi 4 and built around it. Casings for the Raspberry Pi 3 have evolved substantially over kind of the course of its life. So naturally, the Raspberry Pi 4 had the same thing happen just because of how popular the Raspberry Pi brand is. And we have this casing here that I saw. It looked pretty good, great reviews, and it has its own cooling solution inside. That's something that the Raspberry Pi 4 you have to be mindful of, is that it does get fairly hot. So we're going to install it into here, and then we'll kind of go over and play some games on this guy. I've already loaded up an SD card with Retropie for this ahead of time, so it'll be pretty straightforward, I think. Now the box for the Raspberry Pi is extremely simplistic. There's not a lot going on here. In fact, when you open it up, it's literally just the board inside. Like, this is a cheap board to buy. Like, it's inexpensive. I don't want to say it's cheap. It's inexpensive, I would say, but you legitimately don't get much with it. There are kits you can buy on Amazon, which I'll link a lot of this stuff down below in the description for you if you want to check it out. But other than the board, you get some instructions and basically a little guide that tells you what you should and shouldn't do with it, you know, temperature related, static, all of that, to be careful when you're handling it. But let's take a quick look around this board. So starting off at the heart of the Raspberry Pi 4, we have our big old SoC right here. That is the Broadcom BCM2711. It's a quad-core A72 processor clocked at 1.5 gigahertz. It is a 64-bit processor. On the GPU side, it's a Broadcom Video Core 6, which is a step up from the Video Core 4, I believe, that's on the Pi 3B. If you've had that and you had good performance on that, performance you were pretty happy with, this is going to be a pretty big step up for you on that front, as many benchmarks show a sizable jump in performance. Some people have recorded 60 to 70% jump overall. Next to it, you can see we have our RAM right here, and this board comes in several different variants when it comes to RAM. You can have a 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, or 4 gigabyte. That is LPDDR4, big step up from DDR2, obviously, from the Raspberry Pi 3, which is awesome. I'm very happy that we had such a substantial jump in RAM. It's really cool to see that. Now, on the back is where things get pretty interesting, because yes, we do have USB 3 ports alongside of our USB 2 ports. So before it was all USB 2, but now we have a much higher throughput in terms of transfer speeds with USB 3, and the Ethernet is true gigabit, which is very, very good for people who have Raspberry Pis and use it for network, all kinds of applications there. You'll be very happy with that. On the side, they opted to eliminate the full-size HDMI port and went with two smaller, like mini or micro HDMI ports here, but this is now capable of 4K 60 on a single display or 4K 30 on a dual monitor setup. So that is really, really cool. The one downside, of course, you'll have to have a cable that then converts the one or both of these even to full HDMI out. It does also have full wireless, up to wireless AC and Bluetooth 5.0, and to cap it all off, they did make the jump to USB Type-C, which is significantly better, of course. I love that everything is going to USB-C. Okay, with all the technical details out of the way, let's go ahead and actually install it into our case, pop the SD card in, and go play some games on it. Now, this case is full aluminum. So that was one of the big things there. It looks pretty nice, very sleek looking. It's the Argon 1 Pi 4, and it looked like a pretty good case overall for everything that you need. Whereas otherwise you'd get like a case and it might be kind of plasticky, and then you gotta also throw a heatsink on, and then you gotta kind of match up the fan. There's a lot going on sometimes with these cases, but this looked pretty good. Also had very, very good reviews, so I guess we'll check this out.
So the reason you saw that montage of it being put together, the audio unfortunately stopped recording because, well, turns out I forgot to change the batteries out in the recorder for that microphone, but still going to talk about it here, and I'll talk a bit about the case as well. Now, the case itself, as you saw, it was pretty easy. Like, it really was not that difficult. There's actually an extension that kind of puts it at at a right angle, so that all the ports go out of the back, which is great. I really like that feature about the case. The cooling is good, has a fan, and for the most part, the entire case is kind of used as a heatsink, which means this case, along with the Raspberry Pi 4, gives us some pretty good results when it comes to overclocking, and I did that pretty much immediately with this Raspberry Pi 4 up to 2 gigahertz on the CPU, and I pushed it to 600 megahertz on the GPU. Now, this entire video isn't really set up to be a tutorial of any kind. I kind of just wanted to build a Raspberry Pi 4 and put Retropie on it now that it's been available. But if you want to find, I think, a pretty good channel for going from like start to finish with Raspberry Pi and to kind of keep up on the news around emulation with it, I would check out ETA Prime. That's probably your best bet for a source to kind of get started with it. But I do like the case. I kind of wish that there was a front USB in some way, whether they route one from the back to the front or I don't know, something, because otherwise you end up having to plug your cable in for like your controller. I'm using just I just wired up an Xbox One controller, but I have to plug it into the back of it, which might be a little strange if you have it in like an entertainment center. You have to like get behind it, maybe take the box and kind of slide it around and plug it in. It's a whole thing. I think it'd be really cool if it was just on the front. But let's talk a little bit about the games. And there is one system I am very impressed with, and it's actually one of the reasons I wanted to build this out, and that is for the Dreamcast. So we're going to save that for the end. But if you bought this system and you're thinking of like Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Genesis, I'll tell you now, they're going to work fine. Like, we're to the point where those systems are pretty much taken care of, developed, emulated, like no sweat there. The Raspberry Pi 3B pretty much took care of those systems as well, so naturally the Raspberry Pi 4 does as well. For example, the Game Boy Advance, that is one that is pretty much taken care of completely. I played some Mega Man and Bass on it, and a few other games, didn't have any issues. It was good pretty much all the way around. But when we go up from there to, say, the Nintendo 64, that it still needs some work. All right, that's what we'll say with the 64. Unfortunately, the Raspberry Pi version of the N64 for the emulators, it's still not that great. Even with the Pi 4 being overclocked, still struggles at times. GoldenEye has some pretty bad stuttering, but I will say it runs about what I would expect from a Nintendo 64, except looks a bit cleaner. Like, I mean, let's be real. You play GoldenEye, you expect some low frame rates on the Nintendo 64, so I guess it at least looks cleaner. Same with Perfect Dark. Banjo-Kazooie kind of ran in slow motion a bit, so that one, unfortunately, was kind of off. But as for a lot of the shooters, some of the platformers, those run about what a Nintendo 64 would run, maybe slightly better with a cleaner image. So I guess there's that. Now, on the other side, the original PlayStation is pretty impressive. I went ahead and turned on Crash Bandicoot to check it out, and it works well. I mean, it's very responsive with the input. There are some like graphical glitches that I noticed, but it was pretty smooth. No issues there. I just played right through it and I said, okay, yeah, that's Crash Bandicoot, all right. And if you play any of the other RPGs, Final Fantasies and others, for example, on this system, and there are a lot of JRPGs on the PlayStation to explore, and even some strange ones, even like some of the Digimon games, they run fine. Like, you're not going to have any issues there. The PlayStation emulators are a bit better, it seems, when it comes to compatibility and just playability versus like the Nintendo 64. Oh, and I also tried out the PSP, that's the PPSSPP emulator on the Raspberry Pi 4, and it works great. It locks, for example, I was playing Crisis Core, locks it at 30 frames, and there are a bunch of other options you can do to play around with the image, possibly frame rate, but I left it how it was, locked at 30, played a bunch of Crisis Core. It was awesome, by the way, to have Crisis Core up on the TV. It was really, really cool. That way I didn't have to do that weird thing where you plug in a PSP to kind of make it work. Didn't have to worry about that. Played it, no problem. It looked pretty good. I mean, it's a PSP game, so it's, of course, this little image blown up to like a bigger screen. But I think for the most part, it worked out pretty well. The PSP emulator is good. But now the main event, and that is the Dreamcast. And I gotta say, it's good. Like it's very good. And the emulator that everyone seems to use is Redream, and that is part of the experimental section of kind of the cores that they have loaded onto Retropie. So you have to go in and install it yourself. But once you do and you start playing games on it, you will kind of wonder, why is this in the experimental section? Because I didn't really have any issues. I think Sonic Adventure crashed once on me, but otherwise it was fine. Now, this was running on an overclocked Raspberry Pi 4. I played it a little bit on its regular clock settings and it was fine. It dipped a little bit into like the lower 50s at times, but once I overclocked it, it was locked at 60. I was playing Crazy Taxi with no issues. I moved over to Jet Grind Radio, no issues. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 played and felt great, which I actually liked the version on the Dreamcast, by the way. The PS1 version was the one that pretty much everyone played, but I think the Dreamcast version was actually really smooth and looked good with the Dreamcast visuals. But everything I played, even Sonic Adventure, the funny thing with Sonic Adventure, I have such a hard time telling if it's just the game that looks glitchy at times or if it's the emulator itself, because it's Sonic Adventure. But like, yeah, they all played fine. And it's impressive, by the way, to see the Dreamcast to this point and the Raspberry Pi to this point kind of just intersecting, colliding right now with the emulation scene and kind of the small, low-powered board scene. It's impressive stuff. The people who are developing these emulators are very talented, clearly. And it's very impressive to see the Dreamcast running to this extent on a board that's pulling roughly 7.5 watts right now when it's under load. It's impressive stuff. Now, from what I can tell, the different variants of the Raspberry Pi 4, if you're just doing emulators, you can probably get away with the 2 GB version. I mean, the 4 GB version is just nice to have, but if you're not planning on doing anything like desktop oriented, like, loading full Linux and like using it as a little mini PC, you're probably going to be okay with the 2 GB variant, I would say. But I would immediately overclock it with a good case. It's just my advice, because it does kind of give it that extra boost of performance. And I gotta say, Retropie on the Raspberry Pi 4 looks pretty good right now. Great gaming device to have. Small enough to fit in any kind of entertainment center. Quiet enough too, very quiet. And now that it has kind of the 4K output and it does pretty well with something like Kodi, it makes sense to even have as like a little media center PC, HD PC kind of to drop in there if you want to just use it to do streaming of movies and stuff as well. Pretty cool device that we have here with the Raspberry Pi 4, and I do recommend it at its price of, I think the roof is like $65 if I'm not mistaken, and they were even selling them at certain Best Buys as well. That are open now or reopening or whatnot. Otherwise, you go on Amazon, grab one, or even grab a kit, and you're pretty much ready to go. Anyway, guys, that is the Raspberry Pi 4 with Retropie now installed, made available currently to load up yourself on an SD card. Let me know what you think about this down below. Make sure you guys like the video on the way out if you enjoyed it, dislike it if not, and I'll see you next time.